Our next speaker is Dr. David Mantik. He's a radiation oncologist, and he's carried out extensive research into JFK's assassination, including detailed studies on JFK's autopsy x-rays and the Zapruder film. He's the author of John F. Kennedy's Head Wounds, a final synthesis, and a new analysis of the Harper fragment. He's the author of the book is, his presentation today is The President's Head Wounds and X-rays. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. David Mantik.
So do I control the slides here?
Yes.
Good morning. JFK's Head Wounds is an ebook that I published, and it's available on Amazon. I am now preparing a hardcover version of that same book and adding a fair number of additional essays, including the following: a 70-page or more essay on the limousine windshield and its exciting adventures in Dearborn, Michigan. And a second long essay, also about 70 pages, is a critique of Tink Thompson's book, Last Second in Dallas. That is a very negative review. The hardcover will supposedly also include a fair number of other essays that I have done in the past, but I think those two in particular are completely brand new. They are written. We only have to organize the book publication, and that's in process. So I think for those of you who are interested in the JFK limousine or in some of Tink Thompson's fallacious claims, you'll find this quite interesting. The talk I'm going to give today is one I've done previously. I didn't know for sure if I was going to be speaking here, so I'm going to borrow my April talk for the Future of Freedom Foundation, which is actually online, and you can locate that. So you don't really need to take notes here. This was a sequence of talks in which Doug Horn preceded me, and that's the point of the first slide. So how do we get there? Are we on? Where are we? Oh, there. Very good. So Doug Horn asked this as his final question. If the JFK assassination was a simple murder, oh, my computer is restarting. Why is it doing that? If I go to the front and read from the screen, you will lose the audio, won't you? I don't know what the computer is doing.
You can always post like that.
Yeah, I don't mind if it's restarting.
First time for everything,
For everything.
for literally everything.
Well, I can speak from in front and hold the microphone if you like.
Okay.
Let me-
And how will you advance the slides? How will you advance the slides? How will you advance the slides?
You're asking me how to advance the slide?
How will you advance the slides on your
Oh, I
PowerPoint?
can't. You want to?
I'm running I'm running that, but we can get Don up. Don, I need you up here, please.
Just
Shannon, will you click the HDMI? Okay, thank you. So you're good, go up here? I'll put your PowerPoint on the desktop, maybe that's what happened. We were running it off your drive, which is your fine. Kill this mic until we're ready. The CIA will stop at nothing.
Your research is just too important for it.
well, I have it on my desktop.
Do you have an HDMI?
Do I
Do
have
you have
one?
an HDMI out? I'm sure you
Probably
do.
do.
Yeah, let's bring
I'm
your
sure you
computer
do.
up here.
Probably did. Ladies and gentlemen, we're having some computer problems. We're going to go ahead and use Dr. Mantik's computer. We'll have it connected and hopefully go in here in just a couple more minutes.
HDMI. In and oh, audio. Where's your audio?
Oh,
Probably on the other side.
there we go. I've never used this like that.
You're the man, sir.
Are we on? We are on. Oh, by the way, the hardcover book should be available on Amazon and the title will be the same, JFK's Head Wounds. Jeff Morley asked a similar question. If a single gunman did this, why does the CIA still persistently refuse to release 60-year-old documents? James Humes, we could ask this question. If a single gunman succeeded, why perform 2 separate brain exams and then hide this from us? And if there was only a single gunman, why vacillate about the skull entry site? And why lie about the location of the fragment trail on the skull x-rays? My colleague, Mike Chesser, has identified very many tiny metallic fragments that lie very near JFK's forehead on the right side. You've seen these on the x-rays at NARA, and so have I, but Mike has really focused on this. And if a snowstorm of fragments, metallic fragments, form the trail across the top of the skull on the x-ray, why does this imply a full metal jacketed Mantik or Carcano bullet? And then we have the puzzling autopsy photograph. 18 Parkland doctors did not recognize this photograph. So the big question is this truly authentic? Were all the doctors wrong? Michael Kurtz cites 8 Bethesda doctors. Now we're in Bethesda, not Parkland. 8 Bethesda doctors who described the same posterior head wound with the big hole in the back that was seen at Parkland. So here's a quote from Daniel Ellsberg. The reality unknown to the public and to most members of Congress and to the press is that the secrets that would be of greatest import to many of them can be kept from them reliably for decades by the executive branch, even though they are known to thousands of insiders. We know that from the atomic bomb explosion in New Mexico. So here's a summary of where we're going today. I'm going to imagine that I'm James Humes at the autopsy, confronting these dilemmas. We're going to discuss their solutions, what the pathologists did not know at the autopsy, and what the official radiologists have said. We'll mention the Harper fragment and review a short list of persistent, preposterous paradoxes, and then reach a conclusion finally with some quotes from Stanley Milgram on the question of obedience to authority. So here are the 3 successful headshots as first proposed by Doug Horn. And as the years pass, I'm more and more convinced that this is reality. There was a shot in the high right forehead, right at the hairline. It was very hard for the Parkland personnel to see because of JFK's hair. There was also, in the green arrow, a shot just anterior to the right ear, near the top. There are many, many witnesses to this. And then, of course, the pathologist identified the yellow arrow, that's the posterior shot, near the external occipital protuberance. And it's just inescapable if you look at the evidence honestly. James Humes, of course, occupies center stage in 1963. And on your left is Boswell, and then Fink is on the right with the bow tie. In 1993, JAMA published this really awful article by Dennis Brio, who won an award for it. Remember that Hume signed on with the US Navy in 1943. Think about this. How many years was this before 1963? It was 20 years. What's magic about 20 years? Well, I don't know exactly what the rules were in 1963, but Humes was completing 20 years of military service that year, and it was late in the year. Online, I discovered that at least in 2017, US military offers very generous pension benefits after 20 years of service. Members can retire with 50% of their final salary for the rest of their lives. How many of you have done that with your careers? 1? That's all. 2? That's a pretty good deal. Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited to all that we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world. So we're going to try to embrace the world of James Humes on November 22nd. So imagine with me that you are James Humes on November 22nd. Imagine being told that there were only 3 shots fired and they were all from behind. So I'm going to play Humes. I see a large hole in the right occiput. This image was prepared for the movie JFK. How many of you have seen this, just out of curiosity? A lot of you, but not everyone. Here's Robert Groden's reconstruction, which is fairly accurate. I think this is really quite close to what Hume saw once the hair was moved so that they could actually see what was happening inside. Quoting Hume's here, "I saw the back of the head, but I did not see the red spot, which is identified with that small red arrow." So Hume didn't see that. And he also said, "I did not wash the hair." The large hole extended into the occiput. And here's what's interesting. In Groden's book, there is a pair of stereo images of this site so that you can do your own stereo viewing and confirm with your own eyes that this is not a 3D image, which it must be if it were realistic. Contrary to a common myth, the scalp was not being stretched over a hole here. I know that from my stereo viewing at the archives because the image is not 3D. If it really were the scalp being stretched over the hole and two successive photographs were taken, they would show a 3D image. That is not what happens. The image is only 2D. And the reason is because it is exactly the same image in both pairs. And the only way that can happen is if they were illegally inserted. So you can look for yourself. The pathologists were unable to completely cover the defect with the scalp, as they themselves admitted. So here's the photograph from the HSCA. Hume says, "In the posterior skull, I originally identify a portion of a bullet entry hole." That's the yellow arrow. "Several centimeters to the right and slightly above the EOP, which is identified with that vertical yellow arrow at the bottom." And of course, we all know that Hume's for the HSCA moved that supposed entry site up by 4 inches or 10 centimeters, shown at the top of the skull. So Hume's invented a new definition. The word slightly means 4 inches. Hume says, "I see the AP skull X-ray and I recall this image on your left. Then compare that image to the one on the right. Which one is authentic?" The one on the left does not show the 6.5 millimeter object, which was not seen at the autopsy by anybody. But there it is in the archives today. It's on the extant X-rays, as I've seen it many times. So how did it get there if it wasn't there at the night of the autopsy? Hume sees the throat wound. Near the throat, I, as Hume's here, speaking as Hume's, note tissue damage at the following sites. At the lung apex, there is a 5 centimeter or 2-inch contusion or bruise. There is also bruising in the strap muscles of the neck. How did that happen? So Hume's immediately recognized that this meant trauma on Elm Street, because bruising does not occur after death. Damage to these sites could not be caused by a tracheotomy. Dr. Perry would surely not accidentally cause a 5 centimeter contusion in the lung. So Hume's knew immediately that this damage had occurred on Elm Street. It has nothing to do with the tracheotomy, and he knew that. So Hume's knew that something had gone through the throat on Elm Street. Tracheotomy is irrelevant. He did not need to speak to Parkland about this. This evidence alone was enough. Boswell later confirmed that while at the autopsy, they knew about the throat wound. Of course they did. It stared them right in the face. Ebersole, the autopsy radiologist, who practiced my own specialty of radiation oncology told me the same story. They knew at the autopsy. Phone calls are not. Phone calls were not required, although they did occur. In 1977, Boswell had an epiphany for the HSCA. He raised the back wound from the 7x4 mm site shown here in yellow. That's on the official autopsy face sheet. But he raised it to the red arrow, as shown here. Gerald Ford concurred with this. Even though Ford was not at the autopsy, Ford nevertheless claimed to know this. Not quite sure how he knew that. Compare these two photographs or drawing on the left. That's Rydberg's drawing for the Warren Commission. And you can circled in blue where he placed the so-called back wound actually in the neck. Whereas on the right, we can see JFK's shirt at the archives. Circled in blue is where the hole is, which I have seen. Are these the same holes? Does that make any sense? Here's the photograph of the back wound at the autopsy. Glenn Bennett said, "I saw the shot hit the president about 4 inches down from the right shoulder." So why did Rydberg put it in the neck? Rydberg later expressed regret for his misleading JFK diagrams, but the archives refused his request to view the JFK evidence, so he published his own book. How many of you have read this? No one? One. Yeah, that's the case, huh? I haven't seen it either, but he did publish it. You've seen it? Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, so, yeah, it's a long time ago. I'm not sure. I haven't tried to check that. Maybe still alive. Hume's about the single bullet theory. Even though we had no CT scans, they were not available in that era. I knew that this trajectory was unlikely. My comment is that it would have fractured the spine, as you can tell from the cross-section, or it would have punctured the lung at a lower level, if that's where it was. But the x-rays did not show that either of those events had occurred. Here's the autopsy face sheet. Hume's. Of course, from our face sheet, I knew that the back wound was much lower than the throat wound, which made the single bullet theory implausible. In the diagram, notice the two horizontal green lines, which show that the left and right anatomic figures are aligned vertically, so we can compare heights. And the two horizontal red lines show you the throat wound on the upper red line and the back wound on the lower red line. And you can see that Hume's was right. There are totally different levels, obvious from the face sheet. Weeks later, that's Hume's, write the supplementary brain exam report, which described a laceration shown here in yellow, which is above the cerebellum, intact in this sketch. But Hume's writes this brain exam, even though Boswell and he both believed that JFK's brain had been buried with the body. How does he do a brain exam if the brain's not there? Hume's says, I describe a 4-centimeter deep laceration, yellow. That's in his official supplementary brain report. So I put it on the skull x-ray as best I could approximate it. By Hume's doing this and saying this in the official report, he implies that this brain was mostly intact below the yellow line, even though he officially describes the entry as near the EOP, which is the red arrow. Does that make any sense? I was lucky, Hume says, that Cornwall for the HSCA did not nail me for the huge discrepancy in this picture. He was very lucky. What about the cerebellum? Hume says at the autopsy, we saw cerebellar damage, but the brain we examined later had an intact cerebellum, so it was magically healed. The high fragment trail on the x-rays would have meant a second headshot, so we had to rewrite the autopsy report and describe the cerebellum as intact. Indeed, the cerebellum was a huge problem. So Hume admits, I'm forced to obfuscate even to lie when necessary. Number one, I see the large occipital hole, so I obfuscate. He didn't deny it. He just avoided it as best he could. On the x-rays, the fragment trail is too high for an EOP entry. So I lie and describe the trail as 10 centimeters lower, so it matches his EOP entry. Magic, he just moved it down. The autopsy cerebellum was damaged, and so it disagrees with the fake brain, so I just ignore the cerebellum. On the x-rays, I see metallic debris near the forehead. I also see the forehead entry wound in the skin on the photograph. So I incise the wound and I ignore the metallic debris. I see bruising in the throat tissues. I know this means trauma while JFK was still alive, so I must lie and claim that the tracheotomy hid this damage. I had 2 phone calls with Dallas during the autopsy, so I lie, or else everyone would know that I knew about the frontal throat entry. I see a temporal bone entry near the right ear, so I ignore it. I correctly identify a right EOP entry, but I later mislocate on video for the HSCA. I had no choice. That entry had to match the high fragment trail, so he moved it superiorly by 10 centimeters or 4 inches. To cover my tracks, I had to write different autopsy reports at different times. After the exam of the fake brain, I had no choice. Robert Carney was mostly present at the autopsy. He was a pathologist and he was later head of the AFIP, the famous pathological institution in the Washington, DC area. And Carney would have done the autopsy if it hadn't been JFK. So he's a very knowledgeable guy. But he remembers that like James Hume and Dr. Robert Walker, Carney recalled a wound on the right side of the head in the temporal area, approximately above the right ear. James Jenkins, of course, is quite specific and definite about this. Here's Dr. Charles Crenshaw at Parkland, reminding us of the forehead entry, which is not the temple entry. Here's an artist's drawing of an autopsy photograph, we think, seen by Quentin Shin in Rochester, New York, the home of Eastman Kodak. Remember that Rochester was also home to Hawkeye Works, where the Zapruder film may have been modified. And notice the correspondence between this location and the previous one with Crenshaw. And here's a composite that Denise Hazelwood put together for a right forehead entry, actually very close to JFK's hairline. And if you want to judge these men for missing the spot, I recommend you try this exercise in front of a mirror, without a mirror, and then try it with a mirror, and you see how difficult it is to point to the exact spot. So now Hume takes a deep breath and says, I can hope for the best. And I succeeded until the HSCA and until the ARRB. And then all hell broke loose, especially in front of the ARRB with Doug Horn. But I got to play golf in Florida for 3 more years until 1999, when I died of lung cancer, just like Ebersol, and took all my secrets to the Catholic corner in heaven and got to meet my fellow favorite Catholic, JFK. But meanwhile, I kept my pension and even got a military promotion. Later, LBJ even gave me the presidential cufflinks after I served as his pathologist. So the HSCA interviewed me, that's Humes, in 1977. They wanted to know about that entry wound in the back of the head. So I changed my mind and pointed to the colic area, as you see here. After all, that's closer to where the fragment trail is. And you can see the tiny white spots superior to that. That's the fragment trail. So even where he's pointing doesn't match very well. And here's a close-up. So he moved it 4 inches from the ELP, which is shown here. This is available on audio at the site shown there, so you can listen to it. The video is available on my online lecture in case you want to watch that. So Humes is before the HSCA. Gary Cornwell asked me some tough questions, and he took all the credit for my 4-inch move. There's quite an interesting discussion in Cornwell's book, Real Answers, about how he coerced Humes to make this move. Cornwell, this is a quotation regarding the posterior skull entry. Do you now have a more well-considered, or a different opinion? Humes. I think I do have a different opinion. I erroneously, that's my emphasis, previously identified the entry site. Did you hear that? Hume says, I think I do have a different opinion. I erroneously previously identified the entry site. Cornwell, is this discrepancy explainable? Humes, I have a little trouble with that. So Humes makes a final statement to the HSCA before he leaves the official and final interview on the subject. I and my associates are quite elated, in fact, that all the substantive findings of the panel are in basic concordance with our findings. And my response is, in other words, don't worry about 4 inches. So the video of Humes with the HSCA is on my online talk. Humes could claim that he was blindsided. He could say that he did not know in time that critical autopsy photographs would be destroyed, that critical autopsy photographs would be altered, and that some skull x-rays would be deliberately lost, and that the 3 extant skull x-rays would be decisively altered. He didn't know any of that. In 1992, Humes recanted his HSCA testimony where he had said that he made an error. Now he's recanting the statement about the error. And JAMA ignored all of this. Humes said, the fatal wound was blatantly obvious. The entrance wound was elliptical, 15 millimeters long and 6 millimeters wide, and located 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above the external occipital protuberance. So my response is Humes's 4-inch move before the HSCA just went up in smoke. He's back at the EOP. My excuses for Humes, and there are some. Humes was placed into a straitjacket that night. He had no choice but to write misleading autopsy reports. If he had refused, conspiracy would have been apparent to all due to the obvious frontal shots. He inserted misleading eyewitness statements into the autopsy report. Eyewitness statements are virtually never included. He did not have JFK's clothing. He did not know about the Harper fragment, which was not even cited by the Warren Commission. He did not know that the magic bullet was bogus or that the FBI had 2 bullets that night. He did know, but he never told us about the 2 brain exams, and for that, he is culpable. Humes was a respected professional, though. He directed the weekly brain cutting sessions at Bethesda, and Gary Cornwell cites the strong respect that he got from the forensic pathology panel. Regarding John Ebersol, the radiologist, he actually practiced as a radiation oncologist. This information comes from 2 successive interviews I did with him on the telephone. He recalled to me 2 phone calls with Dallas during the autopsy. The first one at about 10:30 p.m. Notice that this occurs after the Secret Service agents have left the room. Malcolm Perry originally also recalled 2 phone calls, and he initially stated they were on November 22nd. William Manchester cites 2 phone calls during the autopsy. Carney, the pathologist we cited before, told the AARRB staff that he was aware of hearsay that Humes had called Dallas to talk to a surgeon later in the evening before the body left the morgue. Ebersole also recalled to me 5 to 6 skull x-rays. Gerald Custer, the technologist, confirmed this. Custer specifically recalled 2 oblique skull x-rays. Later government experts misled us. The HSCA forensic pathology panel trusted the photographs, and they ignored the autopsy pathologists. But they were not told that there was no provenance for the photographs, that the camera did not match the photographs. Another myth, they all believed that x-rays were as immutable as God himself. Of course, the real problem was that they never had actually worked in a darkroom, so they did not know how x-ray copying was done at that time. I didn't either. I had to do some real research to find that out. Later government radiologists, what they missed or deliberately ignored. Fragment trail is centered at the front of the skull, many tiny particles right at the forehead. They ignored the forehead wound on the photograph, the one that was incised, presumably by Humes rather. The magical materialization of the 6.5 millimeter object, they never explained how that suddenly appeared like a magic rabbit. The absence of the object on the internal, on the lateral x-ray. Then as we see that obvious 6.5 millimeter fragment in JFK's right orbit on the frontal x-ray, but we don't see it on the lateral. How's that possible? What about the missing upper temporal bone seen on the x-rays? They didn't address that. They did not address the white patch. And of course, they knew nothing about the absence of emulsion under the T-shaped inscription. They didn't even think to look for that. Warren Commission did not utilize the autopsy materials, so we can't blame the Warren Commission too much, but the subsequent official government radiologists really led us astray. They missed all 3 clues to X-ray alteration. The optical density was outside their worldview. That concept, that phrase was never discussed. And the white patch is indeed otherworldly. The 6.5 millimeter object simply cannot materialize like a rabbit between 63 and 67, nor can it be absent from the lateral X-ray. That's not reality. These experts were too obtuse to look for a missing emulsion under the T-shaped inscription. They never thought of it. Furthermore, the forehead shot was obvious. Tiny metal fragments precisely at the forehead cannot possibly imply a posterior shot, yet that's what they did. Russell Morgan was the sole radiologist for the Clark panel, whose report came out in 1967. So here's a newspaper article based on an interview with Russell Morgan. The title is Expert Backs Warren Report. I've changed the title, crossed out the backs, and put in what they should have said based on his interview. It should have said Expert Questions Warren Report. Look at the yellow block. The key questions remaining, he said, are those of possible conspiracy. How does that back the Warren Report? Russell Morgan had his own Groundhog Day. The fragmentation depicted on the X-ray slide was so severe that one had to wonder if it was a so-called dum-dum or hollow point bullet. What? Is that in the Warren Commission? Is it in the Clark panel report? I never read that. Russell Morgan was doing his last-ditch effort to CYA. The above article, which you just saw, appeared in the Lansing State Journal on September 16th, 1977. Remember that date because when did Hume's testimony occur? It occurred on September 16th, 1977, the very same day that Russell Morgan almost recanted. Do you think Morgan knew what Hume was going to say and was trying to CYA? It was the first day that the American public saw the skull x-rays. The forensic radiologist is the so-called ultimate expert. Even John Fitzpatrick for the ARRB confessed that he could not solve the paradox of the 6.5 millimeter object, but he ignored my optical density data. And in response to my letter, he offered only cliches. That's all he had. Instead, for the ARRB, he returned for a second day because he was so nonplussed by this thing. He just stared helplessly at it and he never explained it. Ironically, his expertise was in childhood brain trauma, not in X-ray forgery. So here's a short list of these persistent and preposterous paradoxes. 2 FBI bullets, not just one magic bullet. More on this in a bit. The lateral X-rays do not match the brain photographs. The lateral skull X-ray does not match Zapruder frame 312. We'll see more of this in a bit. No blood is seen on the hair, but the shirt is soaked with blood. How does that happen? The lateral skull X-ray, the 6.5 millimeter object, is nowhere to be seen. Fitzpatrick was totally confused by that too. White patch is absent from JFK's premortem X-ray and from all other human skull X-rays. It's only present on the postmortem X-ray. An impossible blur exists in Zapruder frame 232. I've had a chance to look at those in the MPI images here in Dallas in 2009, November 20th. These are first generation copies, and indeed the impossible blur is there as well. Costello pointed this out. So we have to choose between the X-rays and the photographs. They cannot both be authentic. On the left is the sketch of the fake brain. And on the right, we have the lateral X-ray. On the right, you see my label empty skull. There is really nothing in there, just air. So on the sketch of the photograph, the yellow arrow shows, the yellow accented area should not show any brain. So we have a gross discrepancy here. Lots of brain in the front in the sketch where there is no brain on the X-ray. You really have to choose. You can't believe that both are authentic. More about the official brain. Hume stated that the brain was not perfused at the autopsy. That is, preservative was not inserted into the major vessels. But the Bloomberg report has Fink stating that the brain looked different at the supplemental exam than it did at the autopsy. Of course, it wasn't the same brain. Horn says, according to numerous medical professionals, this was a very well-fixed brain in the official photographs. It looks very gray and very firm. It's not pink at all and does not appear to be soft in any way and seems as it would appear after at least 10 to 14 days of fixation. And since Hume's directed the weekly brain cutting sessions, he would have had no shortage of substitute brains to use. No one needed to volunteer for this. Missing body parts besides JFK, whose brain is missing. These luminaries are also missing body parts: Einstein, Beethoven, Galileo. So the moral of the story is plan ahead and rest in peace, not in pieces. So we focused on this before. We have the very well-washed hair. and virtually no blood on the hair anywhere, contrary to what the witnesses recall, versus the shirt, which is absolutely soaked with blood. So how did the shirt get so bloody when the hair escaped virtually any blood at all? And if you look at the Zapruder frame 317, you can see a supposed wound there and bright on JFK's right face. How does that wound cause the bleeding you see on a shirt? That doesn't make sense either. So I did my own experiments in our X-ray suite. I placed a cut-off section of a 6.5 millimeter fragment on an authentic human skull, as you see there. You can see how very obvious such a metal fragment would be. Compare it to the one on JFK's autopsy X-ray on your right, which is barely visible. So that doesn't make sense either. And then, of course, I took data from both of them and compared them, and the data also are wildly different. The optical densities show a profound difference between the real and the fake objects. And my data was taken on the extant X-rays at NERA, not on any copies or images elsewhere. So Greg Henkelman, a physics major and radiation oncologist for 30 years, made this statement in his review of my ebook on Amazon. Dr. Mantik's optical density analysis is the single most important piece of scientific evidence in the JFK assassination. Unlike other evidence, optical density data are as theory-free as possible, as this data deals only with physical measurements. To reject alteration of the JFK skull X-rays is to reject basic physics and radiology. Dr. Mantik has a PhD in physics and has practiced radiation oncology for nearly 40 years. He is thus eminently qualified in both physics and radiology. We also know that Brugioni disagrees with the extant Zapruder film. And if you haven't seen this, it's worth a watch. Brugioni was a photo expert. He wrote this book on the left. And just for fun, I attached another slide on the right of the Commissar vanishes, showing how blatantly the Soviet historians changed history by blacking people out. Now, this image is one of the most remarkable images, I think, in the whole JFK case. This is Zapruder frame 312, supposedly at the instant when the head bullet hit JFK, according to the Warren Commission. So David Josephs superimposed the skull X-rays over that image. The black arrow basically shows the direction of the metallic fragments in the skull X-ray. Now, if you accept the Warren Commission conclusion that there was only one headshot, that's it. Of course, the red arrow, or the tail of the arrow there, shows where the pathologist actually put it. So we have a gross discrepancy there. But if the orientation of JFK's head is correct and the metallic trail is authentic, where was the shooter? Either in the floorboard or in a balloon above Dealey Plaza. This is crazy. That's what we have to deal with. The white patch magically appears. The pre-mortem X-ray for JFK is on the left. There's no white patch there, but it's clearly there in the post-mortem. And the optical density is grossly unreal. But it's even worse than that. If there really was such a very dense object on the lateral X-ray under the white patch, there must be a correspondingly dense object on the frontal X-ray. That's reality. If you look at an object in the real world from two perspectives, it doesn't just vanish because you move around. Well, that's what happened here. The first public account of this was given at the New York press conference in 1993. And the numbers bear this out. If you compare the optical density of the petrous bone, that's the really dense bone around the ear, to the optical density of the white patch. In normal patients, as you see here, it should be about 0.46 or thereabouts. JFK's premortem is 0.43. That seems okay. But on the postmortem, look at what it is. It's just way off scale. And Mike Chesser has confirmed all of this as well. Chesser took the optical density data from the premortem X-ray at the JFK Library in Boston. And here's a magnified view of his data. We're not going to look specifically at that, but it's consistent with what I just told you. Hume's on the lateral X-rays, that the white patch was indeed not on the original X-rays. Surely it wasn't. It's consistent with Hume's weird reaction to these X-rays during his ARRB deposition. I don't understand why that is. You'd have to have some radiologist tell me about that. I can't make that out. I don't understand this great void here. I don't know what that's all about. In other words, he didn't even recognize these X-rays because they've been altered so drastically. And then, of course, the magic rabbit appears. On the left here is a greatly magnified view of what I saw with my extremely myopic eyes on the extant X-rays, not on copies. This is the real deal. On the far left side, there was indeed a metallic fragment, which is shown cross-hatched here. This object actually lay at the back of the head, and that's what we have seen already on the lateral X-ray. There really was something there on the back of the head, but it was small and pretty hard to see. But even worse, there was a tiny metallic fragment inside the 6.5 millimeter bogus object. That's impossible in the real world, and it only means a double exposure. And I've shown you such a double exposure from Fielding's famous book on special effects cinematography. Why could I see a double exposure that no other radiologist could see? Ironically, because I was nearly blind. High myopia is like wearing a low power microscope. That was me. My severe myopia was minus 8.75 diopters. Only about 1% of Americans are that bad. How many government radiologists had severe myopia? I'm not talking metaphorically here, of course. High myopia, that's -5, afflicts only 4% of the US population, but I was well beyond that. So I got lucky. I was nearly blind. My X-ray double exposures, 1963 variety. These could have been produced in 1963. And this shows the cutout for the template I used with the key there to give you some idea of size. Larry Sturtevant was the HSC expert in physics about this 6.5 millimeter object. Quote, as radiologist David Mantik points out, there is no corresponding density on the lateral X-ray. The apparently metallic fragment was just as mysterious as when we went into the archives. In other words, he couldn't figure it out either. In a previous email, he had declared that this object could not represent an authentic metal fragment. He was right. So we have only 3 skull X-rays left, not 5 or 6, as Ebersol and Custer said. All 3 are copies. Each one has been altered. The left lateral has this T-shaped inscription on it, which we'll discuss in a minute. Both laterals have a white patch, and the AP X-ray has this 6.5 millimeter fake on it. Let's look at this T-shaped inscription. This is not JFK's skull X-ray. This image is not available to the public. So this is an anonymous patient. But on the JFK lateral X-ray is this T lying on its side. I don't know what it means or who did it or what it's supposed to say. That's not important. Its physical characteristics are what is important. So the only way this could have gotten onto the film is if someone had scraped the emulsion off the side of the film. They could have used their fingernails maybe, or a metal tool. But the fact is that the emulsion should be visibly missing from the actual X-ray. And it's not missing. The emulsion is intact everywhere. I had Steve Tilley take the X-ray out of its transparent plastic container so we could actually look at the sides of both sides of the film. And I looked at it under light reflection from many directions. Thank you. And there's no emulsion missing anywhere. So this is not a smoking gun. This is more like Moses. This is the burning bush. The only way this could have happened is if someone copied an original film that had the T-shaped inscription on it. The copy film, of course, would not have been modified. The emulsion would have been present on both sides. And so that's what we thought. This is a copy film. Let's see, I have 5 minutes left. So let me pursue this. Oh, okay. Well, let's talk about the 2 bullets at the FBI, shall we? It wasn't just one magic bullet. The images here, of course, are the magic bullet. Richard Johnson delivered a bullet to Chief Rowley at 7:30 p.m. This is based on the work of John Hunt, by the way, which was really clever. John Hunt, unfortunately, is no longer with us. So there is the actual document. Red arrow identifies the time. Robert Frazier claimed to receive a bullet at the FBI lab from Elmer Lee Todd, remember that name, at 7:30. And there at the bottom, you see the actual document. So 7:30, Elmer Lee Todd. At the White House, Elmer Lee Todd receives a bullet at 8:50 from Rowley, and he places his initials on the bullet. And you can see the document there. Frazier says the bullet arrived at 7:30. Todd took possession of a bullet at 8:50. How could Frazier receive a bullet in the lab from Todd at 7:30 if Todd did not have the bullet until 8:50? Frazier acknowledged receiving the Todd bullet by putting his personal mark, RF, Robert Frazier, on the 8:50 p.m. Todd envelope. We have that. But CE 399, the magic bullet, cannot be the same bullet that Todd handled on that day. So a second bullet was delivered to the FBI lab. John Hunt concludes, the historic CE 399 bullet introduced into evidence before the Warren Commission is not the same bullet that Todd handled on the day of the assassination. Unfortunately, whatever bullet Todd actually handled that day has apparently been lost to history. Know of anything else in this case that's been lost? Elmer Lee Todd's initials are not on the magic bullet. You all knew that? This NARA photograph was labeled by John Hunt. At NARA in June 1994, while viewing the actual bullet, not pictures, David Mantik and astronomer Steve Majeski confirmed that Todd's initials were missing. Then there's this incision shown by the arrow that was not seen in Dallas. Who did that? Boswell said there was an incised wound. What causes wounds? Scalpels? No, they cause incisions. Wounds are caused by bullets, but there you have Boswell. It was an incised wound. There was a wound that somebody put a scalpel through. The temporal bone is shown here in pink. It was missing on the x-rays as confirmed by G.M. McDonnell for the HSCA. And Mike Chesser has also noted that some temporal bone was missing. But if you compare the HSCA trajectory in blue here, how does that blue trajectory knock out pink bone? Doesn't make any sense. The other options are, of course, the EOP entry, which might, that's the red arrow. But of course, the most obvious one is the entry near the right ear shown in purple. that clearly will knock out some of the temporal bones. So that's a very viable trajectory. Here's a temporal bone inside the skull. I'm going to skip over the Harper fragment here. You can read about that in my ebook. But this is a very important fact. The metallic smear is on the outside of the Harper fragment. And in all of Tink Thompson's recent book, he forgot about this. And so his analysis is fatally flawed. He just simply forgot about this. Here's the paired images from Grodin's book that you can do your own stereo viewing on. Absolute Proof, page 174. You can buy these stereoscopic viewers fairly inexpensively, or you can even make your own. If you have a pair of images that are authentic, you will see a 3D effect. Whereas if they're identical, and you can play around with this yourself, you won't see a 3D effect. You just see 2D. It's that simple. So what I saw was a 2D image. There's not a 3D image at the archives. Yeah. So it's obviously a fake. Somebody inserted exactly the same image into each one of the pairs. So you get a 2D image. So the scalp was not being pulled over the skull. That doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent with what I saw. All right, let's try to wrap this up. Here's a summary. The medical quest is over. We now understand the paradoxes. Daniel Kahneman, who I quoted, but you didn't hear them, was right. For the media, a good story is all that matters. Data is not important. We're seeing that today, aren't we? Someone, perhaps Humes, removed bullet fragments from 1 to 2 bullets, no longer visible on the X-ray. Someone, likely Ebersol, doctored the X-rays. 3 headshots, forehead, right temple, ELP. The forehead shot cannot explain the occipital hole. The temple shot cannot explain the fragment trail. It was sheer madness for the HSCA to elevate the real shot by 4 inches and to accept the 6.5 millimeter fake as authentic and use it as a foundation pillar for their conclusions. Finally, do not trust government committees. In 1963, Stanley Milgram showed how willingly humans follow orders from authority figures. James Humes, the chief pathologist, had a double dose of subjugation, one from the military for 20 years and another one from the Catholic Church, which he attended promptly after the autopsy. He did not even go home to sleep. Some of you will be interested in reading Stanley Milgram's book. I think it's great. Oh, does Doug Horn have connections? This was my recent rental car plate in Ohio. I just flew in from Ohio last night. This book may not be known to a lot of you, but you should read it. Fry the Brain by John West. The most important aspect was using contract killers. Oh, in view of Coup in Dallas, which just came out. How many of you have that? Coup in Dallas? Yeah, it just came out this week. In view of that, this is a very strong confirmation. The most important aspect was using contract killers, sniper teams with deniable connections. They included the Corsican mob, confirmed in this new book, the American Mafia, Cuban exiles, and domestic triggermen. These teams were compartmentalized, probably not in sync with each other, which compromised the operation. After World War II, Hitler's top commando, Otto Skorzeny, built his global assassination headquarters in Madrid near Ava Gardner and Juan Perón. And Skorzeny plays a huge role in this new book, Coup in Dallas. It's a must read. From the homeland of the brave new world, Daily Mail, November 22nd, 2020. More than a quarter of UK students self-censor their opinions because they fear the universities will cancel culture, and 40% are afraid their careers will be ruined if they speak out. Humes would have understood this. Abraham Lincoln, America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. And there's the ebook coming in hardcover. Thank you. Well,
That's a brilliant presentation, Dr. Mantik.
thank you. That's very kind.
Please give us the name of your new book that's coming out.
JFK Headwinds. It's the same as the ebook.
Okay.
And the additional title will be plus additional essays, probably it'll say.
Okay. As a layman researcher, I've always thought the JFK head x-rays were fake because of so many witnesses seeing a large blowout wound in the back of his head. Is it your contention that the x-rays were faked to cover up that blowout wound, or were they just faked in other areas?
No, the exit wound is visible on the skull x-rays, and I skipped over that portion in my talk. I could have shown you the optical density data that confirms that. So the back of the skull is missing on the x-rays, just where the Harper fragment was.
Okay.
You cannot appreciate that with the naked eye. That's the problem. No one can, not even the experts, because there's too much overlapping material. So you have to do the measurements.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Mantik, don't go away, please. I've got a question for you myself. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mantik is featured in Oliver Stone's new movie, JFK Revisited. I don't know if have you seen it yet, Dr. Mantik?
No, I haven't.
I have,
Oh, you have?
and you did a great job.
Okay.
And there's a question I would like to ask you, if I may. You referenced Gerald Custer. Now, Gerald Custer is the x-ray technician who did the autopsy x-rays at Bethesda. Have you seen the video that David Lifton did for his video Best Evidence?
Probably many, many years ago.
Okay. Well, there's something that, well, by show of hands, how many of you have seen the movie or the video Best Evidence? In that video, and I want to address it and just see what you think about it and see if you recall it. In that video, Gerald Custer is talking about being ordered as a military person to do an x-ray. And when the body of JFK was received, the back of the head was blown out. And Paul O'Connor was one of the technicians, and he was aghast, but the brain was missing from the skull.
Yeah.
And Gerald Custer in the video talks about being ordered to do an x-ray on a skull that has no brain. And he's perplexed why he should do that. And he says, they're just do what you're told.
Yeah, Ebersol ordered him to do that.
And he talked about, and this is startling. Gerald Custer talks about that the gaping wound in the back of the head was so massive that he doubled up his fists and actually put them inside JFK's skull.
Yeah.
He also talks about
Groen's reconstruction is consistent with that.
He also talks about actually finishing up the autopsy x-rays and seeing Jackie Kennedy leading the coffin into Bethesda.
Yeah.
How is that possible? He's already done the x-rays on JFK's body when Jackie's bringing the coffin into Bethesda, thinking she's still accompanying JFK's body. You definitely want to see it. It's called Best Evidence. It's on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you had any comment on that video or that.
No, I
that
remember
concept.
all that. I agree with what you said. It's another paradox. Thank you.
A strange paradox. Thank you, Dr. Mantik. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, another round of applause for Dr. David Mantik.